Thank you. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to be here with all of you today and share this day and this experience with you. So what is it that we actually practice when we practice mindfulness? We intentionally focus our attention, bringing it into this very moment. And whenever the mind wanders away, we're redirecting it back into the here and now, getting in touch with the sensation in this moment, and thereby developing a clarity of perception, becoming clear and awake, knowing what we're feeling in this moment. We're meeting our experience with a specific attitude that's characterized by, and you brought in these words and this moment, so they're all with us, of course, openness, with curiosity, and with kindness. And it wouldn't be mindfulness practice without that. So this internal attitude of friendliness, of loving kindness, is an integral part of mindfulness. With the practice, we're developing insight into the patterns of our minds. So we become familiar with how the human mind functions, what's going on in the mind, and gaining insight on that. With that, we come into a position where we can let go of patterns of the mind that we find are maladaptive, that are not skillful, and that don't support us in our internal freedom. So we let go of attachments and avoidances that we typically bring to our experience. We typically meet a lot of what we experience with attachments or avoidance. So we intentionally or deliberately let go of that, as well as letting go of the narrow identifications that we tend to have. We tend to identify ourselves very narrowly as a static person with characteristics, so letting go of that, and instead coming to resting in awareness itself, not being so identified and attached to the contents of our mind, but really coming to resting in the wider awareness within all of the experiences are showing up and dissolving. Mindfulness has been integrated into a lot of different programs. So a lot of different mindfulness-based programs are out there at this point. They are evidence-based, and there is increasing research activity. And this is a graph that shows the number of publications per year on the topic of mindfulness. And you can see it really took off only about 10 years ago or so. And the number of research studies are increasing exponentially. So there is a lot of increasing number of research out there. And still, we're only at the very beginning. And I want to say that up front as a caveat. So to say, the research is still in its infancy. Many open questions have not been answered yet, and we can't really make conclusions. I will make a lot of suggestions and interpretations today, but really only very little is known at this point. However, the research studies that are out there demonstrate various and very promising findings. So we have, and I've picked out a few that seem relevant for the context of this conference today. So mindfulness has been reported to support us in keeping our focus, attention regulation. It helps in regulating emotions, to decrease stress. There are some studies showing enhancements of creativity and problem-solving competencies. And importantly, it can lead to greater connectedness and compassion that we have for others. And with the talk of today, I want to go through each of these points and just give like one or two ideas and thoughts. I also want to connect these findings with neuroscience, and that's the research that I am mostly engaged in, is to look at the neuroplasticity that happens as people practice mindfulness. Neuroplasticity refers to the capability of our nervous system to change in accordance to what we learn, what the new skills that we acquire. So we see changes in the brain as people practice and make themselves familiar with the attitude of mindfulness, and I want to show you some of these findings. So first of all, coming to the topic of attention regulation, and it is obvious, and I don't need to say that in today's society, we're confronted with an enormous sensory overload. We're bombarded with information anytime. So it is important that we're able to keep our focus, to focus on what's relevant, focus on what's meaningful for us, and be able to remain with that intentionally. And research shows that components of attention that help us do that can get strengthened by mindfulness practice. There is a number of studies out there that show enhanced attentional performance. For example, following relatively brief mindfulness courses. Research has shown that experienced meditators show better performance in attention tests. However, also with that research, we have to say that we see medium effect sizes in meta-analyses, and some meta-analyses come to the conclusion that definitely more evidence is required. But a lot of studies are very promising in that they report especially early improvements that have been pretty well established in executive attention. And executive attention is the ability to disregard the distractions that we face along the way, being able to keep our focus. And I want to say a little bit about the neuroscience of that. The brain region that supports the ability to sustain attention, to this executive attention, is called the anterior cingulate cortex. And several studies at this point have shown that the anterior cingulate cortex gets strengthened with mindfulness practice. We've seen that in experienced meditators compared to novices. Activation in this area is greater. Activation increases with a relatively short training, and the cortical thickness in that area of the brain is greater in experienced meditators compared to non-meditators. A very recent meta-analysis that just came out concludes that there is pretty consistent anterior cingulate cortex activation with mindfulness practice. So that's one of the findings that seems relatively well established. And the neural correlate of the ability that helps us to stay focused on what's meaningful and relevant for us. Aside from the attention regulation, another area that receives a lot of interest is emotion regulation. When we're countering our emotions in a state of mindfulness, we're bringing awareness to, first of all, bringing awareness to the way we're feeling, really noticing, knowing the emotions that are present, and meeting them with acceptance and kindness, as opposed to fighting them or getting into internal reactivities about them. So that can be considered, and that leads to a process of enhanced regulation of emotions. And when you think of emotion regulation in the brain, and this is a very, very rough model, but the areas that are relevant are the limbic system. That includes the amygdala. The amygdala fires when we're confronted with fear-provoking or stress-eliciting situations, and activates the body's responses to the stress. And then what's relevant is the prefrontal cortex, the higher areas of the brain that come in and help us regulate the arousal of the amygdala. So the prefrontal cortex is thought to as a regulating instance that helps regulate activation of the amygdala in order to regulate our emotions. So we wondered what happens in the brain in exactly these regions when people practice mindfulness. And we've conducted a study in Boston at the Harvard Medical School where we've looked at the change in brain activation in these regions following an 8-week mindfulness-based stress reduction course in people who report very high levels of anxiety. And what we find here is that there is a change following the MBSR course, in that only the MBSR course and not our active control group led to an increased connectivity between the amygdala and prefrontal cortex, as shown here. So there is an enhancement in the way the two work together. Connectivity refers to how well they collaborate, you could say, with one another, how well they communicate. And we see there is a significant enhancement and increase in the way they communicate. So people are thereby better able to regulate themselves. We've seen that that this enhancement of connectivity is correlated with the decrease in anxiety levels that people report. So the better these brain regions work together, the more people can reduce their anxiety levels. So there is a clear relevance for well-being here, and an important finding to see this enhanced emotion regulation capacity. Along with this improvement of emotion regulation goes reductions with stress. So regulating our emotions helps us better deal with stress. Stress is defined as the subjective experience that we have when we feel we can't handle the challenges that we face in our lives. And the prevalence, of course, and I don't need to say that, is drastic and increasing. And it has a potentially very bad effect on our health. Regarding the effects of mindfulness programs to reduce stress, meta-analyses also conclude that we do need more research, but a lot of studies really show that mindfulness can lead to quite significant reductions in stress levels. Okay, so when we have stress levels, cortisol levels in the body rise. And cortisol, when it has moderate levels, it can have activating effects on the brain regions, including the hippocampus and the amygdala. So they get activated and help us deal with the stress. However, when the stress becomes too much and the cortisol levels rise to a level that is over a longer period of time becomes too big, then that can really have damaging effects on the neurons in the hippocampus. It really destroys the tissue, in particularly the hippocampus, where we see that people with high levels of stress have reduced volumes of this brain area. In the amygdala, higher stress and higher cortisol levels have the opposite effect. It tends to get hyperactivated and bring us into a state of constant arousal. So we wondered here what happens in the brain when people practice mindfulness. Can we see some reversals of these bad effects that stress can have on the brain? And we found in a study where we again looked at the impact of an 8-week MBSR course, a mindfulness-based stress reduction, on this time the structure of the brain, so the gray matter in the brain. We find that MBSR over 8 weeks leads to increases in the gray matter in the area of the hippocampus. So increases in the group that went through the MBSR program, no change in those who didn't. The hippocampus is relevant for learning and memory processes, as well as also for emotion regulation. So some important implications for this preservation or enhanced volume of this brain structure here. In the amygdala, we find the opposite effect, namely that decreased stress following the mindfulness course goes along with decreased gray matter in the amygdala. So while highly stressed populations show higher gray matter in some subregions of the amygdala, we see the opposite effect. So again, an effect that is very much in line with the idea that stress gets reduced here. See those changes even in the structure of the brain over 8 weeks, which is pretty impressive, I find. Okay, so stress and performance. We know that a little bit of stress can be performance enhancing. It can stimulate us to get to a bigger performance, to have just a little bit of stress levels here. However, when stress becomes too much, we know performance decreases and performance suffers, obviously, from chronic stress. And chronic stress can impair creativity and problem solving. So what about creativity and problem solving with mindfulness? Could we enhance those capacities? And some colleagues, there's not a big number of studies out there, I have to say. It's really only just a handful of studies looking at that. But some studies report that some forms of creativity and also problem-solving capacities can get enhanced, can increase with mindfulness practice. We have done one study in Boston also, a colleague of mine, and our group has done that study that looked at fluid intelligence. And fluid intelligence refers to the capacity to solve novel problems, logical thinking. We know it's related to levels of education and work success. So you measure that by just your typical intelligence tests. And we know that fluid intelligence declines with age. So it's pretty impressive here, that decline that you see when people get older, where other capacities, of course, increase, but fluid intelligence, our capacity to solve problems, really drastically decreases. So we wondered what happens with people who are experts in mindfulness meditation, and for that study also yogis, people who practice yoga. And we find that this decline that we see in the controls is not there as much in the yogis and meditators. There's a significant difference here between these groups. In that yogis and meditators don't show the same decline. This is only a very, very first study, and it's not a longitudinal study, so more research definitely needs to be done to come to conclusions here. But it is promising, I would say. Okay, so with that, I only have 2 minutes left, and I'm coming to my last point. I want to talk briefly about mind wandering. And mind wandering is something that we actually do all the time. It's when we begin to observe our minds, we're surprised to see how much our mind wanders away. When the minds wander, we now know in neuroscience what gets activated is the so-called default mode network that includes some midline brain structures, and that get activated as we dream of, we take ourselves into other spaces and times. So some colleagues have wondered what happens with this default mode activity with meditation. And they found, this is a study from Yale, they find that the activity of these brain regions is changed in experienced meditators as they meditate. Different studies have a little bit of different findings here, but the idea is that the default mode of our brain changes. So something seems to happen differently when the minds wander, or they're less likely to wander off with experienced meditators. And then another area of research has looked into what actually happens when our minds wander. What do we do so much of the time of our day when our mind wanders off? What is it that we're busy with? And a lot of the time, we're really busy with thinking about ourselves and how situations in the world are relevant for us. How is what I'm experiencing relevant for me in this moment? So a lot has to do with the perspective on self, and that perspective on self does change with meditation practice, and I think that is probably one of the key changes that we want to understand and look at much better. In the early stages of meditation experience, people report to have more self-esteem, more self-compassion. They're just better at knowing how they feel and stepping in for their needs. When the experience with more expertise, what they report is a reduced identification with that static sense of self. Being less attached also to this idea that we have about who we are, about self. So that is what really changes here. So with that, we're in a position where we just can feel more, and this is one of the other words that Munira brought up today, possible to feel more connectedness, to experience that we're all in the same boat in our human experience, and less preoccupied with ourselves, but more able to open and feel connected with others. What also increases is compassion and the willingness to help others who are in need. There's one small study that I'm citing here that showed that an 8-week meditation practice, mindfulness or compassion meditation, led to enhanced willingness of the participants to help someone who is in need. And of course, at this point, we're really curious also to look at the findings of Tanya Singer with her resource project, who systematically trains the capacity of compassion with others. Okay, and with that, I want to come to just summarize my findings here. So we find research shows promising first findings in the areas of attention regulation, emotion regulation, decreased stress, creativity and problem solving, connectedness and compassion. And obviously these all have relevance not only for mental health, but with the way we work together in organizations, how we go about our days and our work life, and important relevance for society as a large. In regard to neuroscience, we're only just beginning to understand the brain changes that occur along with these changes. We've summarized those in a recent review, but we're just taking our first steps there. Okay, with that, I want to end this presentation and thank you all for your attention.